Chapter 9 gets us into confidence intervals for two samples. Now recall Chapter 8. You talked about the basics of confidence intervals. So Chapter 9 should be relatively familiar to you. Introduces us to 5 new tests. You can see those there on the first page. You're going to be comparing two population means with sigma, the standard deviation known, comparing two population means with the standard deviation unknown, comparing two population means with the sigma standard deviation being unknown again, but now they're dependent samples. So the first test we did was with independent samples, but now they're dependent samples in the third section. And then in section 4, comparing two population proportions, and then 9.5, comparing two population variances. These are very similar type tests, and you should be able to work through the examples fairly easily. The key thing there, I would note, when you come up with a solution, just be sure, and when you look at the solution, because you're talking about a confidence interval, if both values are negative, well then your data in sample 1 is going to be less than, in that confidence interval, the data in sample 2. If both intervals are positive, then the data in sample 1 is going to be greater or larger than the data in sample 2. But if 0 lies in the origin, or lies in the interval, excuse me, for example, if the first bound is negative and the second bound is positive, well then we can say that there's potentially no relationship between the two samples. So you really should be able to follow through fairly easily the examples. I do highly recommend that you use your T83 or T84 calculator to do these calculations. It makes it quite easy. And the book does a very good job at explaining how to calculate these. Also, of course, the Hawks page does a very good job. Notice in 9.2, when sigma is unknown, you're going to have to use S, the sample standard deviation, as your approximation. You also are going to have to use N-1 and N1 minus 1 and N2 minus 1 as your degrees of freedom, and you are going to be using the t-table when sigma is unknown, whereas you'll use the z-table typically when sigma is known and you have a large enough sample size. The dependent sample in 9.3 is a pretty neat analysis. It's also oftentimes referred to as the paired difference test. And then you do the proportions in 9.4, and then the variance explains it fairly well in 9.5. The test, as I said, pretty self-contained. For the testing the variances, though, you will need to use the F-table, somewhat a little different for us. But I don't think you'll have too much of a problem with Chapter 9. It seems to be pretty self-contained. Again, the proportion test at 9.4, you go back to the z-table on those. I think getting your tables, which table you use, just comes with the familiarity of the problem and how many problems you work. I would also recommend that you do try to work some of the problems out of the chapter. Hopefully you've been doing that as we go through, in addition to the Hawks. Again, I'd read the chapter, I'd go to the Hawks program and go through the homework, perhaps come back to the chapter on each section and work some of the problems in the textbook by hand. Make sure you can work those, and by hand I mean you're writing it out, but of course you are using graphic calculator to help your calculations and check things. Go back, do the quiz and review, and make sure you're okay. So as I said, Chapter 9 shouldn't be much of a problem. Please let me know if you have any issues with it as we move forward. Thanks.